I walked into the boardroom that morning thinking it would be a normal meeting. I was wrong. The room smelled of expensive coffee and fake smiles. Michael, the CEO, didn't even stand. He just looked at me and laughed. "Derek, we've decided you're not worth our time," he said, pushing a folder toward me like it was garbage. My heart sank. Years of work, late nights, and loyalty crumpled into one cold sentence. They didn't see me, they never had. I wanted to yell, to demand respect, but I held myself back. Instead, I left quietly, though my mind was racing. Every number I'd mastered, every client I'd brought in, every deal I'd closed, they were blind to it, but I wasn't. They thought they could erase me, make me disappear. They were wrong. Derek Shawn wasn't someone you could just dismiss. As I stepped out that door, a spark ignited inside me. I made a promise to myself, I would turn their billion-dollar empire against them. Every sneer, every dismissal, every insult, I'd make them pay. And they'd never see it coming. Before I tell you how I got my revenge, hit that like button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this ends. I went home that night with a heavy coat and a heavier heart. My apartment was silent except for the hum of the fridge. I sat at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and stared at the screen. Everything they had taken, the job, the respect, the trust, they couldn't take my knowledge. I remembered every client, every deal, every weak point they relied on and ignored. I could use it against them. I began making lists, carefully, in a document only I would understand. Clients who trusted me, accounts left unprotected, files that could be leveraged. I wrote passwords in codes only I knew. Every note, every plan, was small and precise. This wasn't going to be loud. It would be invisible at first, a shadow moving beneath their notice, a quiet storm. I called Eli, an old friend who still believed in me. He answered on the second ring. I told him everything in short, careful sentences. He agreed to help but warned me to be patient. I smiled, because patience was my weapon. I would hit them where it hurt, silently, and they would never see it coming. I waited 2 days before I made my move. Timing mattered. I did not want to rush. I watched their schedules, learned their patterns, and chose a quiet Thursday when everyone was tired. I dressed in a cheap jacket and walked past the guard without looking nervous. Inside, the building smelled like paper and old perfume. My heart was steady. I carried only a notebook and a calm face. At my old desk I opened an account I still had access to. I did not break anything big. I changed a contact email by one letter. A single small cut. Billing notices went to the wrong address for 1 week. I watched from home as calls piled up in their office. Panic rose in their voices when clients said they did not get invoices. It was tiny, but it worked. If you like our revenge stories, please subscribe for more. We drop powerful news stories every day, filled with truth, emotion, and justice. Don't miss the next one. And remember, some stories hurt, but they heal too. Subscribe now, and join the journey. The company scrambled. No one knew it was me. They blamed glitches and vendors. I smiled quietly and saved the proof. Proof would matter later when the stakes were higher. For now, patience and small cuts were enough. The first move was done. They would pay soon. I was ready for the next. The week after the small cut, the company still stuttered. Michael called emergency meetings. People shouted and pointed fingers. They hired outside IT, blamed vendors, and promised clients fixes. I watched every move like a hawk. My little change had opened a door. Now I needed to widen it. Eli met me in a quiet cafe. He wore a jacket and carried a USB stick. We spoke in sentences. He had found gaps in their backup systems and ways to hide tracks. We can nudge their clients, he said. Make them doubt processes, not people. I agreed. Subtlety was better than noise. We planned 3 softer hits that would look like hardware failures and human mistakes. Each one would push them closer to losing trust. I worked nights, planting evidence that suggested negligence and slow response. I let their top clients wait on hold, then called pretending to be a worried partner. I sent proofs to myself and saved logs on drives they would never check. Watching them scramble felt like sharpening a blade. The more they flailed, the clearer my path became. They thought they fixed a leak. They had opened a river. I sat in my car and watched the building for an hour. The city lights blurred, and I thought about how small things become big. Their calls increased, and their top client, Nova Systems, was quiet. I knew trust was thin. I sent an anonymous report to a compliance email and waited. Hours later, an angry message appeared on a public forum. That post spread like a paper boat in rain. Inside the company, meetings stacked. Faces went pale. Michael paced and asked who was responsible. They tightened controls but also cut corners to show action. Their hurried fixes made new gaps. I used those gaps. I helped an old vendor find a missing file by leaving hints that pointed to mismanagement. The vendor complained loud and public. The story grew. I did not celebrate loudly. I kept proof and notes in a locked folder. Every small ripple pushed the company further from calm. Clients whispered. Partners hesitated. I felt cold satisfaction knowing my plan moved forward without fire or noise. The river I built was widening, and I stayed ready for the dam to break. When it broke, they would taste the cost and regret. I made a list of people who knew the company better than most. Not all of them were enemies. Some were tired, some were angry, and some simply wanted change. I reached out to a junior accountant named Mark who had been passed over for promotion. He met me in a park and looked nervous. I offered him a chance to be seen. He wanted to matter more than money. I did not promise money. I promised truth. Mark gave me access to a quarterly report that showed how numbers were shifted to hide losses. He did it quietly, saving copies. I taught him to mask his tracks and to leave breadcrumbs only we would understand. With Mark's help, the pattern became clear. Misreported profits, ignored debts, and a missing audit trail. I felt the puzzle shift into place. Each piece added weight to the story I planned to tell. This was not about revenge. It was about righting a wrong and forcing them to answer. At night I read the reports and mapped the names. My hands shook sometimes, but not from fear. I shook because I finally held the proof I needed. I held the report like a map. Each line showed where they hid debt and pretended profit. The names felt heavy. I thought about clients who trusted us and workers who stayed honest. This was bigger than a grudge. It was truth that had to be shown. I made copies and locked them in 3 places. One went to a secure cloud Eli controlled. Another copy was hidden with Mark in a safe folder. The last I printed and placed in a box at my old locker, wrapped in an old jacket. Layers would keep the truth alive if one link broke. Then I wrote a short note that explained the problem without blame. Facts would speak louder than anger. I planned who would get the notes and when. Timing mattered, too early and they would bury it, too late and I might lose momentum. I thought about Michael and how he had laughed. I thought about the team who trusted me and felt betrayed. This was for them. I felt steady. The pieces were in place. Now I needed the right moment to make everyone listen. I waited a week before taking the next step. Patience was my ally. I sent an anonymous tip to one of the smaller clients, showing just enough of the misreported profits and missing audits to spark concern. I didn't include everything, only enough to make them question the company's honesty. By the next morning, emails and calls poured into the office. The client wanted answers fast, and the panic spread like wildfire. Michael slammed his fist on the table during a management meeting. They tried to spin explanations, but each call exposed more cracks. Their hurried reactions created new errors. I watched it all unfold from my apartment, feeling a mix of anger and satisfaction. Each mistake they made fed the path I had carefully prepared. I documented everything quietly, labeling the evidence by date, time, and reaction. Eli helped monitor digital footprints to make sure nothing traced back to us. I reminded myself that this was just the beginning. Small, controlled nudges would eventually topple the walls they had built around themselves. I smiled. Derek Shawn wasn't just taking revenge. I was orchestrating a reckoning, and the river of consequences had just begun to flow. Enjoy our revenge stories. Subscribe, like and drop your location in the comments. Calls from clients became louder each day. Michael tried to control the story, but his voice shook. New emails arrived that accused them of hiding losses. One client demanded an immediate audit. The company promised fixes, but their responses were slow and messy. Each answer made them look worse. I watched their panic grow. Eli sent me logs that showed phone times and response delays. Mark found more shifted numbers in a backup file. I felt both proud and sick. This was working, but people were losing jobs and trust. I told myself the end would be worth the cost. Then a news outlet picked up a tip and wrote a short piece about a mid-size firm under scrutiny. The article was small, but it spread on social media. Employees read it aloud in the break room and faces turned pale. Michael ordered a press statement that tried to calm everyone, but it sounded rehearsed. I prepared the next move. I would not destroy lives unnecessarily. I wanted truth and accountability. My actions would bring the truth into light and force them to fix what was broken. The river had become a strong current. The newsroom called. A reporter said they had questions about the article and wanted interviews. My chest tightened, but I stayed calm. This was the moment I had waited for, the spotlight that would show the truth. I prepared a clear set of facts, not anger, and posted them. Eli and Mark helped coordinate. Eli sent encrypted files to a trusted journalist. Mark confirmed numbers and added annotations that made the story impossible to ignore. I watched the news site update and felt a cold clarity. The piece named discrepancies, missing audits, and the failures that leadership tried to hide. Readers reacted fast. Social feeds filled with copies and comments. The company replied with a short statement that avoided real answers. Inside, panic turned to blame. Michael demanded names and documents. People pointed fingers while lawyers read every line of the exposed files. The board called an emergency meeting. Clients called for pauses and audits. My hands shook, not from fear but from the truth finally opening. I had arranged for support for honest employees and suggested fixes to the journalist. I wanted repair, not ruin. Exposure had arrived. Now the hard work of change would begin. The morning after the story broke, chaos ruled the office. Phones rang non-stop. Michael shouted, pacing the floor. Managers scrambled to explain missing documents, shifted numbers, and delayed invoices. Emails stacked up faster than anyone could answer. The cracks I had planted were turning into gaps, and the house of cards trembled. Clients canceled contracts or demanded immediate reviews. Some asked for refunds. Their trust evaporated, leaving panic in its place. The board was furious. Miller, one of the senior members, called for immediate action, but no one knew where to start. The audits showed more mistakes than anyone expected. Every tiny error I had uncovered now magnified under the spotlight. I stayed calm at home, watching from afar. Eli updated me every hour, showing client complaints, internal memos, and errors amplified by stress. Mark sent the latest numbers, highlighting where the company would stumble next. I took careful notes, preparing for the final moves. The dominoes had started to fall. One mistake triggered another. Derek Shawn's plan wasn't loud, but it was unstoppable. I smiled quietly, knowing the storm I had set in motion would leave them reeling, and finally, facing the truth they had spent years hiding. By midweek, the pressure inside the company became unbearable. Michael's face showed strain he couldn't hide. Emails and calls kept piling in. Clients demanded explanations and timelines. Managers argued over who was responsible. Every wrong decision, every slow response, made them look weaker. Their billion-dollar empire suddenly felt fragile. I watched quietly, analyzing each reaction. Every misstep strengthened my position. Eli tracked the digital movements while Mark verified the inconsistencies in real time. We worked like shadows, leaving no trace of our involvement. Each report we collected became a piece of undeniable proof. I smiled at how the smallest changes had escalated into a full-blown crisis. Michael tried to assert control, but panic spread faster than his commands. He blamed middle management blamed teams, and clients lost faith. Their communication became frantic, fragmented, and chaotic. I knew exactly where to push next. A single strategic move could shatter their credibility completely. I reviewed every file I had access to. Every email, every ledger, every overlooked detail mattered. Derek Shawn's plan wasn't about revenge alone, it was about exposing the truth, forcing accountability, and reclaiming what I had earned. The storm I had begun was now uncontainable, and the next wave was ready to hit. The day started like any other, but I knew it wouldn't end that way. Internal reports showed growing client dissatisfaction. Emails flagged urgent issues. Michael's attempts to reassure everyone fell flat. Even his closest allies looked doubtful. The cracks I had been quietly widening were now turning into chasms. I met Eli at our usual spot. He showed me updated logs and analytics. "They're running out of excuses," he said. I nodded, feeling a strange satisfaction. Mark had uncovered more mismanaged accounts and hidden losses. The evidence was irrefutable. We had built a chain reaction, small cuts had become fractures, and now the pressure was pushing the company toward collapse. I didn't act recklessly. Each move was measured. I sent a carefully worded anonymous tip to a major client, including proof of misreported profits. Within hours, their panic intensified. Michael called an emergency meeting that ended in chaos, with board members arguing and employees frustrated. From my apartment, I watched it all unfold, recording and documenting every reaction. Derek Shawn's plan was working. The storm I had orchestrated was real, unstoppable, and precise. Soon, every person who had doubted me would face the consequences of underestimating me. This was more than revenge, it was justice. By now, the pressure was crushing the company from every side. Michael barked orders that went ignored. Managers argued, clients demanded answers, and employees whispered in fear. Every weak link I had identified before now came alive. Eli and I reviewed the list. "Some of them will break under scrutiny," he said. I nodded. That was the point. The small errors I had planted earlier were magnifying, and people who had ignored responsibility would now be exposed. Mark had sent updated files showing more discrepancies in invoices, accounts, and contracts. Each revelation was a dagger aimed at the core of their authority. I started contacting select clients, subtly guiding them to the documents they needed to question the company. Anonymous emails and hints created doubt, and doubt quickly turned into panic. Michael tried to manage the narrative, but he was too late. The company was unraveling. At night, I documented everything carefully. Every reaction, every panic-filled email, every defensive meeting was proof. Derek Shawn's plan had reached a critical point. The river I started was now a flood. Soon, every lie, every mismanagement, and every failure would be undeniable. I felt a cold satisfaction. Justice was close, and their empire teetered on the edge. Michael's attempts to regain control were failing fast. Every day, new client complaints landed in the inbox, each more urgent than the last. Managers grew defensive, employees whispered about mistakes, and the board demanded immediate solutions. Panic spread like wildfire. I watched from a distance, tracking every detail. Eli monitored digital footprints while Mark verified mismanaged accounts. Every error, every delayed response, and every overlooked detail became a pressure point I could exploit. Small cuts had grown into fractures, and now the company felt like it was collapsing under its own weight. I carefully chose my next move. An anonymous tip to a high-value client exposed misreported profits, forcing them to question the company's integrity. Within hours, the client demanded answers and threatened to pull contracts. Michael called an emergency meeting, but confusion ruled. No one knew where to start. From my apartment, I documented every reaction, every raised voice, every defensive statement. Derek Shawn's plan was unfolding perfectly. What started as a quiet, invisible retaliation had become unstoppable. The river of consequences I had created was now a torrent. Soon, the empire that once laughed at me would face the reckoning it deserved. The boardroom smelled different that morning. Tension hung in the air like a low cloud. Michael tried to speak, but his words fell flat. The board members read the reports I had helped make public. Their faces went white. Someone whispered about audits and lawsuits. The room felt smaller. I followed the live feed from my laptop. Eli sent updated logs, and Mark pushed more files that showed hidden transfers. The evidence stacked up like blocks ready to fall. Miller, who once smiled at me, asked sharp questions that Michael could not answer. Accusations moved across the table like a wind. I felt both calm and strange. Outside, clients waited for decisions. Inside, panic spread. The CEO tried to steady things, but trust had broken. I sat in my apartment and watched the empire wobble. My plan had reached the place where leaders had to look at the truth and fail. This was not only for me. It was for workers who were honest and for clients who deserved the truth. The boardroom had shivered, and the building of lies began to crack. Derek Shawn watched, steady and ready for the next move. I knew Michael was desperate. He tried to patch things up with clients and staff, but every move seemed to make matters worse. I stayed quiet, observing. Patience had been my weapon so far, and it would remain so. Every mistake they made, every hurried decision, was ammunition I kept carefully documented. Eli and I reviewed our plan. The leaks, the mismanaged accounts, the small errors, they had become an unstoppable cascade. I contacted a few key clients anonymously, nudging them toward the evidence they needed to see the company's failures. Mark double-checked the numbers to ensure nothing could be traced back to us. Everything had to be precise. Michael's desperation grew. He argued with his managers, blamed vendors, and tried to create distractions, but the tide had already turned. The cracks I had planted turned into gaping holes in their credibility. Clients demanded audits, contracts were paused, and even loyal employees looked over their shoulders. From my apartment, I reviewed the growing chaos. Derek Shawn's plan was no longer subtle. It was a quiet, controlled force that chipped away at an empire built on arrogance and lies. Soon, the company would face a reckoning it could not escape. And I would be ready. The tipping point came quietly, almost imperceptibly. A major client, one of the company's largest, discovered a misreported invoice and threatened to pull their contract entirely. Michael's calls went unanswered. Managers scrambled to explain, but every answer raised more questions. Panic had become a constant presence in the office. I stayed calm, observing each reaction. Eli monitored the company's digital activity while Mark continued verifying inconsistencies. Every small error I had uncovered became a weight pressing down on the leadership. The dominoes were falling faster now. Michael's attempts to regain control only exposed more weaknesses. I sent another subtle nudge to the client, highlighting additional discrepancies without revealing myself. They immediately escalated the issue to the board. In internal meetings, employees argued and pointed fingers. The board demanded immediate fixes, but the evidence was undeniable. Every lie, every mismanagement, every corner cut now lay exposed. From my apartment, I smiled quietly. Derek Shawn's plan had moved from careful preparation to unstoppable momentum. The empire that had once laughed at me now teetered on collapse. Soon, every person who underestimated me would witness the consequences of arrogance and negligence. Justice was no longer a whisper, it was a storm approaching fast. The breaking point arrived on a Monday morning. Emails from clients flooded the office. Calls went unanswered. Michael's voice was tight, strained, trying to sound in control but failing. Managers blamed one another. Panic spread like wildfire. The empire they had built on arrogance was cracking, and I watched every moment with quiet satisfaction. Eli updated me constantly. Every client complaint, every internal argument, every failed explanation was logged. Mark sent files highlighting even more hidden mismanagement, transfers, and overlooked debts. Each revelation was another brick removed from their walls of control. The company scrambled to fix things, but they were chasing shadows I had carefully planted. I made one more anonymous move, sending a critical document to a key investor. Their phone rang off the hook. Michael called an emergency meeting, but no one knew what to say. Fear filled the room. Staff whispered, managers panicked, and the board demanded explanations. From my apartment, I leaned back and felt the weight of what I had accomplished. Derek Shawn's quiet plan had grown into a force they could not withstand. The company had finally reached its breaking point. Soon, they would have to face the truth, and the consequences of underestimating me. The morning was electric with tension. Michael paced the boardroom, shouting at managers who could offer no answers. Phones rang non-stop, emails piled up, and clients demanded immediate resolutions. The company that once laughed at me now teetered on the edge. From my apartment, I monitored every move. Eli fed me logs and updates. Mark verified every discrepancy and confirmed that the chain reaction I had started was unstoppable. Every mistake, every mismanaged account, every delayed response became undeniable proof of their failures. I decided it was time for the reckoning. Carefully, I released a complete dossier to a trusted journalist, showing the full scope of misreported profits, hidden debts, and ignored client concerns. The story went live within hours. Social media exploded. Clients canceled contracts. Investors demanded explanations. Michael and his team scrambled, but it was too late. Inside the company, panic turned into chaos. Employees whispered, managers argued, and Michael's face showed the strain of a man losing control. Derek Shawn's plan, quiet and precise, had reached its climax. The empire built on arrogance and lies now faced the consequences it had ignored for far too long. Justice was no longer coming, it had arrived. The company's walls were collapsing faster than anyone could stop them. Clients demanded immediate audits, contracts were paused, and vendors pulled back. Michael's voice sounded frantic over every call, his authority shrinking with each passing hour. Managers pointed fingers, blaming one another. Panic spread like wildfire. I stayed calm, reviewing every report, every email, every reaction. Eli tracked digital responses while Mark confirmed the gaps in the company's records. Every piece of evidence I had gathered now worked together like a machine. The small cuts I started months ago had become a flood, eroding the empire from the inside out. Michael called an emergency board meeting, but the room was filled with tension. Directors asked hard questions, employees whispered, and trust had vanished. The chaos I had orchestrated revealed the full truth of their mismanagement and arrogance. From my apartment, I leaned back and observed. Derek Shawn's quiet, calculated plan had not only exposed the lies but had shown the world the cost of underestimating me. The empire that had once dismissed me now faced collapse, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop the inevitable reckoning. The storm I started had arrived fully, and it would not relent. By now, the company was fully exposed. Headlines splashed across the news: misreported profits, hidden debts, ignored client complaints. Social media amplified every detail. Michael tried to respond, but his statements sounded weak and rehearsed. The board demanded immediate action, but the cracks were too deep. I monitored every response carefully. Eli tracked digital footprints to ensure nothing could trace back to us. Mark verified the latest discrepancies, confirming that the evidence was airtight. Every move I had made, every tiny error I had nudged, had now grown into undeniable proof. Clients canceled contracts, investors demanded refunds, and vendors hesitated. Panic had turned into chaos. Inside the office, arguments erupted. Managers blamed Michael, employees whispered about resignations, and the board realized the full scale of mismanagement. Derek Shawn's plan had shifted from quiet revenge to complete exposure. The company that had laughed at me, dismissed me, and treated me as worthless was now under a spotlight that left no corner hidden. I leaned back, feeling a cold satisfaction. Justice was not a loud act, it was a precise, relentless force. The empire built on arrogance and deception now faced the reckoning it deserved, and there was no way to stop the consequences I had set in motion. The company began to crumble openly. Key clients terminated contracts, investors withdrew support, and vendors refused to continue without full audits. Michael's attempts to control the narrative failed completely. Every meeting, every email, every explanation only exposed more errors. Panic and fear ruled the office. From my apartment, I followed the chaos with quiet satisfaction. Eli sent me updates hourly, showing the full scope of the fallout. Mark continued confirming discrepancies, highlighting every hidden mistake that leadership had tried to cover. My careful planning had turned small errors into a total collapse. Michael called emergency meetings, but no one listened. Employees whispered about resignations, managers pointed fingers, and the board finally recognized the extent of mismanagement. The empire that once dismissed me as worthless was now crumbling under its own weight. I stayed calm. Derek Shawn's plan had reached its final phase. The slow, invisible storm I orchestrated had become unstoppable. The company's arrogance and lies were fully exposed, and now the consequences could no longer be avoided. For months, I had waited for this moment. And now, watching the empire fall apart, I realized that every late night, every careful move, every patient step had been worth it. Justice was complete. The office was quiet in a way I had never imagined. Michael barely spoke. Managers and employees moved cautiously, fearful of the next exposure. Contracts were cancelled, investors demanded explanations, and the media continued covering the fallout. The empire that had once laughed at me was in shambles. I stayed in my apartment, reviewing every report one last time. Eli confirmed that all digital traces led nowhere. Mark verified that every discrepancy, every mismanaged account, every delayed invoice was now documented and undeniable. My careful planning had worked flawlessly. I didn't celebrate loudly. Revenge, I knew, was not about noise, it was about precision. Each small step I took had grown into a full reckoning. Michael and his team now faced the consequences of their arrogance and negligence. The company would rebuild slowly, if at all, and every client, employee, and investor now knew the truth. I leaned back, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a plan executed perfectly. Derek Shawn had not shouted, had not raged, had not begged for recognition. I had acted deliberately, patiently, and decisively. The empire that called me worthless now understood its cost. Justice had been served in silence. It was over. The company was in ruins, Michael humiliated, and the board scrambling to recover. Contracts were lost, clients gone, and the truth exposed for all to see. The empire that once sneered at me now faced the consequences of years of arrogance and mismanagement. I sat quietly in my apartment, reviewing the final reports Eli and Mark had sent me. Every error, every misstep, every hidden problem had been documented and revealed. My revenge had not been loud, chaotic, or reckless. It had been precise, patient, and unstoppable. Derek Shawn had turned the tables, using knowledge, strategy, and silence as weapons. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The results spoke for themselves. Michael and his team were left to clean up a mess of their own making. Clients had been warned, and employees who had tried to stay honest were vindicated. Justice had been served. I closed my laptop, leaned back, and let the quiet satisfaction wash over me. I had been called worthless, dismissed, and ignored, but in the end, I had been the force they never saw coming. Derek Shawn had the last word, and it was written in their ruin, not my anger. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more powerful narratives, and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear what part hit you the hardest. Thanks for watching.